This is episode 274 of the Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts podcast. This episode is titled, How to Write Better About Drugs. And don't forget to check out our past episodes. Lots of interesting stuff back there that you can listen to for free. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts. I'm your host, Jennifer Crittenden. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Thank you for joining us, and tune in on Mondays for new episodes. I'm so pleased to welcome a new guest to the show today. Miffie Seideman is with us. So welcome to the show, Miffie.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we're here to talk about Miffie's really great new book. It's called The Grim Reader, A Pharmacist's Guide to Putting Your Characters in Peril. And although you listeners won't be able to see this, I'll show it here just in case we ever get a clip so that we can show this. Oh, it's not showing very well on my camera. But it's a really cool cover and a great title and also a really good book. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I'm going to start by introducing you, and I'll just use the bio from the back. Miffie Seideman has called Arizona home for over 30 years with her amazing family. She received her Doctor of Pharmacy from the University of Illinois College of Pharmacy and found her passion in newborn intensive care and drug safety. Miffie spent over 2 decades in that field and loved training the next generation of pharmacists to care for the tiniest and sickest of babies. She also helped develop a specialized computer nutrition program for premature babies and has been published in peer-reviewed pharmacy journals. She loves using her pharmacy knowledge and career experience to assist other authors through their writing journey. When Miffie is not elbow deep in drug information, she writes fantasy novels and trains for triathlons. Yeah, so one of the things I really enjoyed about this book project is, well, it's unique. I've never seen a book like it where you're attempting to help writers write about drugs and drug interactions and things that happen with drugs in a realistic way in their fiction. Or I guess in their nonfiction too, although presumably in their nonfiction, they know what they're doing. But in their fiction, yeah, we don't. And I wanted to start with a story because I'm taking a novel critique class through Gotham Writers, the writing program in New York City. And it just so happened that one of the critiques that we were doing, I think it was just last week, actually, what involved a scene where a woman has a rag put over her face and she is instantly out and abducted. And so I said, it's funny that this happened because it just so happens I'm reading this book called The Grim Reader. And Miffie, the author of that book, suggests that that wouldn't happen normally. I mean, totally fine with me if you want to write that in your book, right? We're fiction writers. We get to do what we want. But just to mention that Miffie said it usually takes a few minutes for chloroform to kick in. So it wouldn't be quite so instantaneous. And so I held the book up. I said, this is a really interesting book. People might want to use this. And the instructor, who is Susan Breen, she's a mystery writer, she said, that's a great book. I provided a blurb for that book. She said, this is really, if you're a mystery writer, you have to get this book. I was like, wow, what an incredible endorsement for this book. So it's already being put to use.
And a small world moment, yes.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, exactly. But it makes sense that she's the kind of person who would gravitate to this book and then really appreciate its value. But one of the things that you do also in the book that I think is interesting is point out that in a scene like that, okay, so maybe the woman wouldn't pass out instantly, but maybe that gives you an opportunity to do some other things with the plot. Like maybe she struggles and fights. And so, you can add more tension to the scene by that. So, yeah, I think it's really great to have this information and then the writers can use it, as they'd like to. but having it out there, I think is the first step in the right direction. So tell me, what inspired you to write the book?
I had been looking for a new writing project for a little while, and I couldn't quite figure out what to do. I had one manuscript that was a fiction sitting on the side, waiting to go back and edit it and finish it. And I have had a history of going in and seeing movies or reading books where the drug scenes are very wrong. Like the one you mentioned with chloroform, a lot of them are the instant out or instant death scenes, and they frustrate me so much. Enough family knows to kind of knock me off in the movie theater and say, "Shh, Mom, don't say anything."
As you're yelling, "Wrong."
They're like holding me back. And so it kind of all just came together at this great moment where the family was saying, "Hey, why don't you write something to help those authors write those better?" And a writing group that I'm a regular member of, we do Zooms once a week, and we've done it for years. They supported that idea and kind of took it a step further and said, "Hey, as a writer, here's what we would like to see." And I kind of took those two concepts and put it together. And so the Grim Reader was kind of born. It went through a lot more evolutions after that, but that was kind of the inception of the idea.
Well, you've really done a fabulous job. First of all, thank you so much for providing an index. This is just the kind of book that really needs an index. And I was so happy to see it because a lot of books these days are skipping that. I know it costs money and all that, but it makes the book just, immensely more useful. But particularly this book, because, I'll ask my listeners to check it out. But each of the chapters really has a wealth of information. So for each of these categories of drugs, you get the brief history, you get a social context of it, you get these little marginal notes that are just like, reminders about things, slang terms, how the drugs are used. And then this part I just love so much, that you provide some writing prompts for people. You also provide some scenes where you might say, okay, knowing what you know now, how would you change this scene to make it more accurate? I mean, each of these chapters just has a wealth of information. And so having an index, really helps a lot to be able to wink all that out. I enjoyed reading the book very much, but I'm sure that it's the kind of book that I would have to go back to, fairly regularly to
Sure.
remind myself of the details of it. But it's very detailed, very pro, an excellent resource book, right?
Thank you. It was really meant to be a very strong, deep reference and that's why that index was so important to me. It did take extra room. It did take a little bit of discussion with the publishers to say, please, this is my vision. Let me go at it. And it's really going to be important. Because to me, when you're coming at the book, what I've heard from writers is, well, gee, I don't know what drug I need to pick, or I have an idea of some symptoms, but I don't know what would do that. And so I've got a section in the book that kind of gives you, if you want this drug, here's a list of symptoms, or if you want these symptoms, here's a list of drugs. So that's one section. But then you can go to the back of the book and say, oh, look, I want somebody foaming at the mouth, and pick out a couple of sections of the book where that occurs. And you wouldn't be able to get to that kind of a granular detail without having that index. There's just so much, that you would miss inside the book otherwise, but it helps bring all that together and funnel you into the chapters that you need to kind of read through and go, aha, this is the one that'll help.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what's fun about it, is you really thought about it from the perspective of a writer, but you brought to it your expertise as a pharmacist. And so it's this, really happy marriage of the two.
Those writer prompts were really, that was part of a really important process for me, because you can give everybody just a bunch of information and say, okay, go write. But I don't feel that that's helpful. It's much more helpful. And this is the way I practiced when I was a pharmacist. You teach the student this little bit of information and get them going on it and say, okay, we'll go use that. Now come back. Let's dig deeper. Let's add some more to that. And so those writing prompts kind of build throughout each little drug section to start you out with kind of the beginning, and then say, okay, well, use your own character, build a scene. okay, let's add some more information. And now what would you do? And try to culminate it in the end with a functional, usable outline for, a good scene that's believable. Yeah, so that was very crucial to how to build those chapters out.
Yeah, I was just realizing that a lot of what you're doing here is teaching, right?
Yes.
Which is something that you know how to do. And so, yeah, you're using those tricks inside this book too. So it's not just a reference manual, but it's also an exercise book as you go through. So again, yeah, it's doing a lot of things this way.
Yeah.
Did you have trouble finding an agent or publisher? Were people interested in this project?
That is such an interesting story. I had a lot of writers that were interested
Yeah.
to the point of, oh, hey, great idea. But you never really know because writing books can be very difficult to put out on the market and make sure that you've hit the right market and you've got the right goal. And finding an agent in that, so I really went about it the other way. I have a very rough manuscript that needs probably a year's worth of love to it. Should I invest all that time in this? Am I barking up the right tree? How do I find that out before I invest all this extra time? And so I went to one of the Writer's Digest one-on-one boot camps. It was an online weekend boot camp, and Talcott Notch Literary Agency happened to be the agency on that weekend. And I looked through the list of agents that were going to be on the boot camp. And Amy Collins' name came up, and she was interested in nonfiction. And I thought, okay, well, I will give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
And so my intent was to go in with my first 10 pages and get it really cleaned up from an agent's editorial perspective and get an idea of the marketing out there. And I did walk away with that, but I also walked away with Amy saying she would like to talk to me more about the project. Okay. And it was just very exciting for me. It was a great moment. I also realized at that same time, it was one of these, this is great. Oh no, because I had this huge manuscript that now I really needed to clean up and put a lot of love in, but it turned that into such a loving project. Like it was a lot of work and there were all hands on deck here at the house. I have a daughter who was at the time, she's a lawyer and she was an editor on a law journal. And so she started it on editing and concept. And my son, who's a medical student, was helping look at it from that perspective. And he's also a screenwriter. So it was a great time in getting Amy a cleaned up draft. But that's how I found my way to having an agent.
Yeah, how fun. Well, you can see, all of the expertise that's gone into the book, right? I think all your contributors really probably made it better. And it's really good. It's really strong. So I should mention it's published by Red Lightning Books, which is associated with Indiana University Press, which is how I found out about it because IU is my alma mater and I often do cover books that they have published. And I've done a few also from Red Lightning before, but yeah, I was really glad that I found the book. Although I think a lot more people are going to find the book going forward because we writers will use it, right? We share that kind of information. So that was one thing I was going to mention again was this idea of sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. We see some of these drug scenes so frequently in the movies that they almost become, I don't know, predictable or boring. It's like, oh, here's the chloroform rag again. But actually, that's one of the things that your book points out is that these drugs are so much more complicated than they're presented in the movies, that it really is true that truth is stranger than fiction, and that it just opens up a whole world to the authors about what they can do as the drugs move through the body, or you get different symptoms, or the doctor is fooled by what's happened to the person. So that's another thing that I think you've done with this book is sort of open our imagination to how we can make all this stuff more interesting.
All the plotting ideas just come out after that. There's so many avenues that you can use. So it's a fun area.
So you do fiction writing yourself, and in your fantasy novels, Do you try and stay close to what you know in real life, or do you just make up a new drug and say this one's going to do whatever it wants? I don't know.
I actually, the fantasy that I'm working on right now does have a potion in it that will help erase somebody's memory for a short period of time. And I don't want to give a whole lot away because it is it's a love story, and this is part of how it turns from happily ever after into this beautiful love story. But I am relying on some real drugs that actually can give you amnesia for short periods of time and how those work.
Oh my.
And trying to use that concept on, okay, well, how would this onset? How would this work? How much memory would really be gone? And how will that show later if I choose to do like a subsequent book to this? How would that look from that vantage point? So definitely pulling in reality, but
Right.
a lot of fun with it though.
And that's another one that sounds really, ripe for all kinds of interesting plot twists. Yeah, if your boyfriend suddenly loses his memory.
Yes.
There's another one in the book that made me laugh. So one of the suggestions that you had for the writing prompts was to write a scene. I was getting in the weeds a little bit here, but it's to write a scene where a parent has engaged in, this is apparently a thing called psychedelic parenting, where a parent will microdose themselves with LSD, a hallucinogen, in order to better tolerate the stress of parenting, or maybe make parenting a little more interesting. Not quite sure what they're up to. But in your writing prompt, maybe they took a little bit too much. It wasn't quite a microdose. And then they go to the grocery store with their child. And of course, a grocery store is such a perfect place to choose because there's so much stimulation in a grocery store, right? So the thought of being at the grocery store with, a little bit too much LSD in your system and your child. So that one, that one really made me laugh. So I had to ask you, how much fun did you have dreaming up these writing prompts?
Oh, so much fun, especially when you get to things like the hallucinogens or the drugs that are touted as being used in small doses to help you, but if you bring in the pharmacy brain, drug errors happen all the time by professionals. You pull that into a family home, and now you've got the mom who's exhausted, who's stressed, who has the kiddos, and she's got a lot going on and has to go to the store. Just taking the wrong number of capsules or grabbing 2 instead of 1. You have potentially this whole other world. And magic mushrooms is another one that is being microdosed with hallucinogenic. So it's, and then considering like, okay, so where would this mom go? Oh, she can drive to school. What would that one look like? Or, well, let's make it a little safer than that because we don't want the children to die in a car accident. Let's go to the grocery store. And the fruit aisle just itself with all the colors and the arrays and the sounds and the music going overhead. It just hit me all at once. Like, this is perfect.
Yes, that would be a very, very funny scene. Yes, we should run a contest for people to write that scene and send them in to us because I'm sure it would be a total hoot. Yeah, what people come up with. To turn to something a little bit more serious. So, tell me about common errors that you see, or really egregious errors that you see in the movies or read in books. What are the ones that really make you roll your eyes?
That's a good question. I think if I think about the main ones that do, they're either the instant death or the instant unconscious. And it to me, it's both from the standpoint of people thinking that's how the drugs really work, because in some cases that can build fear in people of medications.
Oh,
there have been some misunderstandings even recently about ketamine with paramedics and some misdosing that occurred. And there are people that I've heard that say, "Oh, I'll never touch that drug. That can kill you."
So what is that drug?
Ketamine is both an anesthetic and a sedative that can be used both in surgery, but it can also be used to sedate combative patients out in the field. So if somebody gets to a car wreck and you have this really combative person that's there, you could use them to sedate that person enough to be able to get them in your ambulance and get them care.
Okay.
But it also has a number of very dangerous side effects if used wrong. So, but that kind of information can really teach your audience and teach your readers something very dangerous and wrong. So that instant out or instant death thing, I've had writers say, oh, well, that happens. I read that somewhere with insulin. And you get people who are like, well, insulin's lethal. I don't want to take it for my diabetes.
Oh.
So there are concerns like that. And I know there are people who I've mentioned that to, and they say, oh, that couldn't happen. But even recently, there has been misinformation out there about fentanyl that it's a great drug. It's a wonderful pain medication. And I've used it in the newborn intensive care unit myself on infants, but it also has this very dangerous potential aspect to it. And that turned into one of those kind of like big fish stories all of its own, that somebody wrote. I think it was a journal article that said that the paramedic was just near the drug and inhaled it, and he passed out and had to have a Narcan antidote given to him or he would have died. And then that turned into, oh, if you just touch it, you could die. And it grew into this, oh, so dangerous. There were some first responders who didn't want to be involved in emergency response and in a scene where they knew that drugs existed because they were afraid that they could die. And it took a toxicology and a very well-renowned toxicology group to put out an article to try to dispel all those rumors. But that's where, when you pick those headlines up and grab those and put them into a story or put them into a scene and think that that's real, you could really be doing a disservice. So there is that side. And then there is the other side where those instant out scenes, like you had mentioned, really just don't get at what we're supposed to do as writers, which is take our readers on that wonderful emotional roller coaster of what's going to happen to our favorite character. And, oh, we're going to turn the page because I see those symptoms just starting, and, oh, they're just getting worse. And now he's stumbling. What's going to happen? Mm-hmm. And so there are those kinds of scenes that really kind of drive me batty because you just let the reader down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really a missed opportunity from a fiction standpoint.
It is.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's essentially misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe I just said that word on my podcast, but I mean, it's leading people. I mean, we all have that feeling. Oh, I've seen that somewhere. I've read that somewhere. Well, it turns out what you read was fiction, right? So
yes. One of the other things that has stuck out is when, and sometimes writers try very hard, but they don't know what they don't know.
Sure.
And so people assume that all drugs that can be given by a pill can also be given as an injection and rapidly hurt your character. And so they might bring up a drug name. Oh, I've heard of this drug. I'm going to have them give it to my character as a shot, and then they're going to knock out. I'm like, well, it's not even available that way. And sometimes your body can't even absorb those drugs, so they can't work. And so that was part of why I spent some time in some of the book explaining what kinds of things you really should go and try to research about your drug. Even it doesn't have to be super deep in the weeds, but here are some basics, including how is it given? How is it given? How will it work? And kind of stick to that so that all your medical people in the audience don't suddenly go, ooh.
Right.
Yeah.
I know. It's so interesting, I think, to think about people in the audience who have this kind of level of expertise about various things. The one that always makes me laugh are the IT things, right? The magic computer things that happen, right?
Sure,
and so,
sure.
So if you have experts, but we just sort of get over ourselves, right? And it's just like, oh, well, that's how it is. But we shouldn't really. I mean, we should try and hold people to providing information that is realistic, especially if doing it wrong is a loss, right?
Right.
That seems like, let's just make our writing better.
Right. And use it for your reader. I have seen, so there are a lot of medical personnel that will kind of shrug that off, but I've also seen on some of those social media threads that are specialty groups where they will lambaste a particular book or a particular movie and say, "Did you see blah?" And you know where they're going with it. And you kind of just sit back and watch it unfold. Like, people are venting, they're getting their stress out. But at the same time, every person who saw that thread is not likely going to want to go see that movie or read that book. And it does tell you something about either the screenwriter or the author in terms of their due diligence and how much they cared when they were writing. So I know that bothers me. Some people maybe not so much, but some of those threads are very funny to listen to or to watch, see how it unfolds.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. And do you ever worry that people are seeing things in the movies or reading in books that you think, this is really bad, that people have this impression because this is very dangerous?
Yeah, I think there all kinds of movies can create that as well too. The things I know there are all kinds of topics that are very dangerous to kind of broach and do out there. Showing your readers how to use drugs in a dangerous way can bridge. You have to kind of really think where you're going with that. How much are you going to show? How much detail? I go to great lengths in the book not to talk about dosing, not to talk about exact mechanisms, because you really shouldn't do that as an author. That's not your goal. The goal isn't to really worry about all the minute detail, and then she drew up 2 million, mils of this drug. That's not it. It's so much more of being able to bring the emotions through and drop in the facts you need to progress that scene. So there are a lot of scenes that you could do out there and scenes that I've seen that if you did it at home, it would be extremely dangerous. But you do have to rely on the audience not to go jump off the building while they're high on LSD either. You just can't leave everything out. But do some prudence as a writer to not give too much detail to be an informational source for too much.
Yeah, a how-to or something.
Yes,
yeah.
Do not have to. Yeah. And I have had people ask me that about the book. I'm like, aren't you worried? And what about legal ramifications? And I really made sure that I did not take it to that level. I was at a book fair this last weekend and somebody said, okay, well, exactly how many pills does my character need to take for this to be realistic? And so I had to backpedal that and say, well, that's not what you need to write. And I can't tell you that information. Is it out there for them to find out if they did research online? Sure. But that's a separate issue. That's not part of what my book does. And I made sure to stay very clear of that.
I see. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. That's funny. It almost feels to me like that would distract the reader. Like if you were that precise, then the reader would start thinking, well, what if she took one less or one more? I mean, which is just pointless, right? That's not, I wouldn't think that's where we'd want our reader to be thinking about.
That's the wrong focus and not the kind of knowledge you need to either have or impart in the scene.
Yeah, another one that along these lines, although that's not what you talked about in your book, was I stumbled across this Reddit thread where a writer was asking for advice about head injury. Because we all see this all the time in the movies, right? Somebody gets knocked on the head and they're conveniently out for a very specific amount of time. And then ding, they're back, right? Full consciousness and no damage whatsoever, right?
Yes. And walking out of the scene, Yeah.
And I'm sure similar to the threads that you were reading from the pharmacists or knowledgeable people. Yes, the responses that this poor writer got back. I mean, it was a little disheartening because, people were explaining, yes, you see this in the movies all the time, but this is not funny and that people can really get hurt. And it doesn't work this way. Basically, this is not real life. But I was thinking, here's another one where we just have all this misinformation out there that people think that could happen. Whereas in fact, a head injury is really serious. And
very serious. And drug errors can be certainly lethal too. It's just it's really a matter of how much do we believe Hollywood and the producers and what they write, and where do you draw the line as a viewer or as a writer to try to stick to what's real.
They're so omnipresent, these
Yeah.
situations, that we start to believe, oh, it must be true because I've seen it in 100 movies, someone
Sure.
getting bonked on the head and then waking up totally fine. So
They're fine, right? And it doesn't mean that I'm against writers using their own imagination either. So I think the beautiful thing about if you understand what the drug true facts are, then you know which rules you can break. If you do them and just break a bunch of rules, you don't look good in the end. But if you know them, then you can kind of play with them. And one of the cases I talk about in the book is truth serum. And there are arguments as to what it is and what it really can do. But there have been some really good books out there that have played with that concept and kind of kept true to what they can actually do, what truth serums actually can do, but given them a different name or given them their own fantasy look. Or there was one in a fairly well-read dystopian. And I thought the author did a great job with not utilizing a real drug that's out there, but using the same principles and bringing that as part of her plot, actually, in sections of it. But she used a lot of imagination, but used some real drug facts. So it was great. It was nice to see.
Yeah, that's really clever too, because another thing you talk about a lot in the book is that names of drugs change, the use of drugs change, the development of drugs change. And so by doing what that author did, you kind of escape some of the traps that there might be in there where that instantly dates the book, or it, again, might take the reader down the wrong path as they start to think, wait, isn't this in the 80s? Wait, wasn't it called? It's like, no, stop.
In particular, when it comes to, and that's true for a lot of street drugs, that those can be pretty dated, and some of them hang around for a long time, but they evolve and change the way that they work. Certainly the marijuana we have available today is not like the stuff that was there in the 60s. So very, very different. But you can also see with prescription drugs and brand names that there's a real legal reason not to mention those drugs by brand name. And so using other things like what the color the pills technically tend to be, and how it works can be really good at describing that without putting yourself at some potential legal liability of naming the company and what bad thing happened to your character. You don't want to kind of go down that legal route.
Yeah. One of the things that was interesting to me in your book, and again, just goes to show, I don't know, how reality is stranger than fiction, but also this idea of what's dangerous and what's not dangerous, what had to do with alcohol poisoning. So yes, that chapter is very sobering about some of the techniques that people are using to really just bypass drinking alcohol, but how dangerous it is. So yeah, I really appreciated that chapter.
Yeah, that one is, it's both interesting to write as a pharmacist, but it can also be very disheartening when you start reading what people are doing and how little they know. And then as part of it, I end up reading about the deaths that occurred and, trying to look at the full picture. And things like alcohol have been around for a really long time and always have gone through these evolutions of danger, or is it getting more dangerous, or how is it perceived in society, and then what does society do with it? So it's becoming much more commonplace for the dangers that we had before, even, and let's just pick on college kids, so sorority, fraternity college kids, and the kinds of alcohol games that might have been played before, and how those have expanded into the modern day and the variety of different ways that they're utilized that can actually be very lethal. And they don't always know how dangerous of a game they're playing until it's too late. And that part can be really difficult, to read and research. But it's also adding something like that into a story can also help readers identify more with your characters too, because they may well know somebody who went that path, or they may have been exposed to that in their own life as well. So it is a reality. So leaving it out and not having some of those scenes in your book is not necessarily the goal as much as mimicking some reality and getting your characters seem more realistic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, from a writer's standpoint, alcohol's readily available. It's very popular. And so if you want to endanger your character, you don't necessarily have to go to some exotic drug. I mean, alcohol is plenty lethal, as it turns out. So yeah, if you want to compromise your character in some way, just have them go to the liquor store.
Well, and that's a good point too, that there is a huge aspect to making dangerous scenes with the drugs. That is certainly a huge aspect, or putting a character in danger. Anything from the caffeine energy drink games that played, the shooter games with that, down to alcohol, to whatever drug. And then there's this other aspect that I really love for authors to look at, and that's how the background of your character, you don't even have to have a character who's doing drugs right now, but maybe their background involves something dark that was surrounded by drugs. And it could be anything from your character is a recovered meth addict who has struggled against that all his life. And now this is his motivation. This is your character's motivation, that he works on the street to help bring youth off of the street to keep them away from drugs. That's a beautiful background. It's dark and it's difficult, but it's not something he's involved in now. And that's a really nice way to be able to play that. You can have characters who are older, who maybe have cancer and have used fentanyl patches, and the sad side of their history could have been their grandchild who passed away in their house by finding their leftover fentanyl patches and thinking they were stickers. I mean, those are sad. Those are also reality.
Yeah.
But they make your characters have these other dimensions to them that they're struggling with, and as part of who they are. It makes them, more three-dimensional.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I hadn't thought of this before, but it's really a reflection of the complexity of drugs, that they're both wonderful and horrible.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Very much so. Yeah. Even when used correctly, I mean, those statements still hold true. As a pharmacist, I always knew that that drugs have these wonderful aspects to them, but you have to always respect their danger and their risks. And my job as a pharmacist in the newborn ICU, I always felt, was to only recommend drugs when they were really needed to do something good, and when they were no longer needed, to help recommend getting them to be stopped, because they always potentially have side effects that are there, even if you're using them the right way.
Yeah. Drugs themselves are complicated characters.
Yeah.
So, right. Yeah. So adding them into a book just adds that level of complexity.
Yes.
So you also talk in the book, you covered a lot of territory about drug-related activities, sometimes inside the chapters, but also maybe things that the listeners might not think of, like body packing. So what is body packing?
Body packing is a very creative way that people have used to smuggle drugs, essentially. And so it involves taking small packets of drugs and hiding them inside a person's body. You can imagine where. They're swallowing, and everywhere you can find a place to hide the drug in order to get through a checkpoint or get through the border or into a prison. And so there are a lot of technologies that try to identify that in those areas to keep people from smuggling drugs. But each one of those packets, if they're swallowing the packets, one good example is that they may have been required by whoever is helping them or paying them to smuggle the drugs, or in some cases, unfortunately many, forcing that person to smuggle the drugs for whatever reason, whatever they're holding over that person's head. It may be hundreds of packets. And each one of those packets often has enough drug to be lethal. And the people that are packaging the packets aren't always that careful about how they're packaged. And so the packages are potentially liable to break. during transit. And so that person dies. Unfortunately, the person who's smuggling that drug is often considered disposable by the
Yeah.
drugs. It's just one more piece of business that happens. But it does lead to very intriguing plots and storylines and maybe backgrounds for somebody that they're involved in or being coerced into, forced into smuggling drugs.
Yeah, I feel as though I've seen scenes like that. Are they often misrepresented in the movies, or do you think what you've seen has been pretty accurate?
I've seen a number that are very, very accurate. I think where some might not be as accurate as where it's very clear that the packet has busted inside of the person and they're still hanging on for another couple of pages while emergency help comes. And, so it makes this drawn out scene. But that's not likely, probably the case. In many of those cases, before medical help can get to that person, they have died.
Mm-hmm.
And it really depends on the drug and how much breaks. But so they're treated in varying aspects that way, often with a little bit more of dramatic flair than they probably actually have. But I've also seen some that are handled very, very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel as though I've certainly understood that that would be extremely dangerous when
Yes.
I've
Yeah.
seen those scenes. But yes, yeah, sometimes it goes the other way, right? This would be really death. And
Yeah.
but in the fiction, yeah, we draw it out for our own purposes. But yeah, some things are fatal. So yeah, there's no escaping the fatality.
Yes, unfortunately. And yet, still in that case, it's still not instant death. So you can still have your character have a packet of whatever drug you've decided is in there, bust or clearly one or more have, and that person is dying, and it's going to take a page or two of very severe symptoms and onset. So it's not going to drop to the ground right away. By the time they realize the symptoms, you may have allowed your reader to see a few onset and giving your reader the inkling that something's bad here. Then the character may just fall to the ground in seizures and then slowly, shortly after that be dead. But it's still not, oh, it busts, oh, they drop, oh, they're dead. And so it's a very sad event, but you can still thread it out a little bit into more of a page turner and something your reader will remember later and think back on.
Yeah, it's another thing I think you do really well in the book is talk about what those symptoms are going to look like. And they're often really, I don't know what word to use here. I mean, they're repellent, right? People are in seizures, they're frothing at the mouth. It's not pretty. It's not like a Hollywood death, right? No. And
Yeah.
but good for writers to know, because again, that's all fodder for their pen, right?
Yes. And I try very hard to to make sure to give them some of the more subtle initial onset symptoms. So, this might start first and then increase to this. And now your character could be doing this. And so they can get an idea of how far they want to push that and how to kind of thread that along. I thought that was, pretty important to make sure not only do you know all the symptoms, but kind of what their timeline is for kind of setting on what's going to be realistic. And then I always make sure that because it's easy when you get all that, you're like, oh, I've got so many great symptoms now, I'm going to use them all. But what you want to do, you don't want a checklist.
That's what you said. Don't use a checklist. Yeah.
It's a little bit like putting the highlights on a painting. You take the symptoms you've got and you kind of brush them in there to color in that picture. And then you look at it and go, I need a little bit more. This is looking a little bit too checklisty. Let's pull back a little bit. But use them sparingly and with great vision, I think is part of the way to build a really good scene.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. So yeah, speaking of drugs in general, it's because you did so much research on the history of these drugs. Did it make you start thinking about humans and their use of mind-altering drugs or just drugs in general throughout their history? It seems as though we have I don't know, kind of a strange coexistence with drugs. What do you think?
We do. And I think part of why it doesn't hit me too hard right now is I lived the life of, going through pharmacy school for years and reading all the historical pieces on a lot of the drugs as I went through my career, like, oh, where did this one come from originally? And what the entire process of used to be of taking plants and plant medicines, all the plant medicinals, and changing them by taking them into a lab, and taking out some of the dangerous parts. And so people have always had this fascination with this drug is great. This one is really good for us. For example, like the leaves, the coca leaves that are chewed in Peru when you're hiking up in Machu Picchu, because you're up at altitude, it helps ward off altitude sickness. But you can also take parts of that plant and try to add in a stimulant. But at some point in time, those natural plants have some other dangerous aspects to them that you want to ferret out. And so my world of pharmacy was a bridge between the existence of natural plants and all that man has found from them all through the years, and how those were tamed. Some ways good and some ways not very good, tamed in a lab to try to produce something that was either had less toxic effects, or would work better or help a different kind of disease. Sometimes, like I said, with good outcomes and sometimes without. So I've always, even I think the one that fascinates me the most, because there are so many drugs that have been used and plant medicinals that have been used throughout the history of mankind. But the one related to belladonna eye drops, with women using belladonna in their eyes back in the Renaissance period, for some reason has always fascinated me.
Me too. I just read that yesterday or today. And I just keep thinking about people trying to deliberately dilate their eyes, right? And because cats, right, have that effect because their pupils dilate so easily. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
But what women will do for beauty? It has that title. What will women do for beauty? And how did the first person end up getting that in their eyes and figuring out, oh, wow, we think this is really sexy? Because that's what they were doing it for, was to try to look like a woman who was aroused, whose eyes are dilated. And it was considered, when a man would look at that, it would kind of trigger almost like a Pavlovian thing, like, oh, this woman is aroused. And no, I take my eye drops. And then they used it regularly enough that they damaged their own eyesight, blurry to blind. All for the beauty of these dishpan eyes, these big eyes. But that's always fascinated me, that something so potentially neat as this one drug could be utilized that way and focused on so much as part of culture.
Yeah, you make a good point. That is this whole idea of taking these into the labs and refining them. That is fairly recent, I presume. Last 100 years, 150 years, maybe?
Yeah, something like that. It's evolved over time, because there were some very crude versions of that early on, with some scientists trying to pull out portions of plants that would work and help. You found that in the old days with poppy seed and opium. So you have opium itself, and then over time, you were able to kind of extract out or pull out different drugs depending upon how it was utilized or how it might have been extracted. And so it kind of evolved over time, and then different drugs would be pulled out of the main chemical. And then you get to the point where things like true synthetics, like fentanyl, are pulled out, where you have things like heroin and morphine and codeine were from that more natural poppy plant itself. And now you're down to fentanyl. You've got this different, very strong pain medication, but it's completely synthetic.
I see.
All of that has evolved from the old days of penicillin, when penicillin was pulled out of a laboratory that was very crude at the time, and now it's come through the ages to look very different, and all of its cousins.
Yeah, fascinating. Because you have a chapter in here. That's where I read the thing about belladonna. And is it called leafy greens? Is that what it's called?
Leafy leftovers.
Oh, yeah, leafy leftovers. Right. Yes, I was thrilled when I hit that chapter. I was like, oh, of course she would do that chapter too. But yeah,
Yeah.
again, a whole literature of people referring to nightshade and, going back to Sherlock Holmes and all those types of things.
That was probably the hardest chapter
Mm.
to write. When you look at the opiates and opioids, there are so many of them, but I was able to really focus on, you could go on, forever on those, focus on the ones that really have made a cultural hit over time, or that were really would provide a very unique aspect to a scene, but bring some reality into it. When it came to a number of the drugs, they just didn't fit nicely into their own chapter. They would have been too small. They didn't fit really. But what they did have in common was that they either involved some sort of a plant material or were a natural plant material, but were used for medicinal purposes and maybe in medicinal use right now. So belladonna is still used medicinally, but in a different way. We don't put it in our eye drop. Well, there is a relative of it that's used in eye drops, so that's not 100% true, but the belladonna itself, the way it was utilized has changed. But that then belonged in that chapter. Things like marijuana certainly belonged. And then I couldn't mention marijuana without mentioning spice, which isn't an herbal. It isn't natural. It's a chemical that's supposed to act like marijuana, but over the years, the kind of chemicals represented in spice have varied and changed until they are it started out as a legal marijuana. We can't use marijuana, but if we use these chemicals, they give a marijuana-like effect. But over time, those chemicals have become much more dangerous with much more difficult highs and dangerous side effects. But I couldn't leave that one out because it was so intimately tied to the history of marijuana. And so trying to pick and choose how far do you go without it turning into an herbal and botanical book, because really it would take a whole nother volume to cover them all. That was very difficult. And so I had to pick and choose wisely what went in there and what didn't.
Yeah, exactly. When I turned the page and saw that, it was like, oh my goodness, yeah, there's this whole world of plants that I hadn't even thought about. But yeah, I'm glad you picked up on the ones that, yeah, we see a lot and would be interesting again for fiction writers. You talk about the fact that drug use evolves over time, and be careful as a writer because you might accidentally be putting something in historical fiction that couldn't have happened back then, or you're using terminology for someone like me where I'm used to terminology from the 80s maybe, but that's not what kids call it today, that kind of thing. And so I was thinking, that's going to happen to your book too, right? That things are going to keep changing. So I just have to ask you, are you already thinking about what's going to happen in 15 years when someone says, well, where's your sequel?
The volume 2.
Volume 2.
Yeah, I have thought about that. To be honest and fair, I do want to get that fantasy done, but the drugs themselves change so rapidly that putting out a second volume has been kind of on the back of my mind of, okay, when would that happen? What should it look like without being repetitive or redundant? And even at the whole last 8 months while I was editing for publication, so I was editing for the publisher, there were chapters that I was having to actively change through edit 1 to edit 2 because laws were changing and new drugs had hit the market that weren't just going to be, something for a novel in 5 years from now, but they were heavy on the scene right now. Things like xylazine, the veterinary anesthetic that is now so rampant in the United States. It's contaminating, for lack of a better word, a lot of other street drugs that are out there. So things like the marijuanas and the cocaines and street opiates like Oxy. The difficult thing with this particular drug is it causes rapidly can cause death with respiratory. Your breathing goes to zero, but the antidote Narcan that works so well for opiate overdose will not work for this drug because it works by a different mechanism. It also can cause sloughing of your flesh and horrible lethal infections. It's
Jeez.
terrible. It's
Oh my
terrible.
God. Truth is definitely stranger than fiction.
It's so bad.
Yeah,
It's like the new zombie drug on the market.
right.
And so I had to stop my edits and say, okay, this one has to be in here now. It can't wait for later. It's so prudent now. But even since publication, every time I pick up the headlines, it's, oh my goodness, they've changed those laws. And now this one's becoming mainstream when the other one was before. And so I'm sure over the next handful of years, within 5 years, a whole new, it's not that what's in this one would be outdated, but there'd be a whole new field of drugs to be able to decide to put in, a new language that's come onto the scene as generations change, and the way they talk changes about it. Yeah, it's pretty funny. The terminology changes are huge when you think of how much they change over time.
Which really is a commentary about language, which is something I'm really very interested in. But yes, all these things coming together here. So my guess of 15 years is probably way too long. But but I can imagine, that you do an updated edition, and there might be, the chapters would need to be slightly modified, but it wouldn't be a wholesale redoing of the whole thing, especially because so many people are writing about the past, and so they're trying to be authentic about drug use in the past.
Right. Yes.
So I have to ask you this question, Miffie. I just recently was reading statistics about how many Americans are routinely taking prescription drugs just as part of their normal life. Presumably, I mean, some of it certainly is for physical reasons, but a lot of it is for mental reasons, right? To manage their mental health. The psychedelic parenting kind of made my eyebrows go up, but okay.
That's a new one.
I was like, well, So I have to ask you, how do you feel about Americans medicating themselves so much? I feel as though this is slightly different than we've seen in previous generations. And what do you think about all this drug use?
So the pharmacist side of me would always perk up and say, look, medicating for depression, but neurologic conditions has been growing since, over the last several decades, everything from things like ADHD and OCD, and then on to depression. And certainly you've got the overlay of what's occurred in society over the last several years from COVID on, and things that included difficulty with communication and not seeing people and having people very isolated, and putting that on a society that already had, if you look at the baseline, and this is a sad piece, and it's certainly not just America, but the sad piece of humanity is we tend to be towards take a pill. A pill will fix something, and we have often gravitated towards that way for other things. If you look at the probably billion-dollar market of vitamins, many people will never need a vitamin, whether it's to lift them up for the day or make their eyesight better. But that market has people convinced that everybody needs to have a one-a-day vitamin and these extra ones. And there are people for vitamins and for things like depression, for which medication really is important. There are a lot of psychological conditions for when medication is going to be the thing that separates their isolation and the problems that they're having and get them back into a functioning person, into society. The rest of that, when you have, everybody's on this drug, or this is the drug of the year, and so many people are so wide open to just throwing another drug into their regimen, that it makes the people who really need those drugs either frowned on or looked down on, like, you're just one of those people taking a trend. And it makes them feel bad about themselves. And sometimes that leads to people not taking the medication they need. And so I think it's a very complicated question. There will always be a group of people who need a certain medication to treat a certain disease that may be fairly prevalent, but doing that judiciously and not expecting everybody to have this mentality of, oh, you take this pill and take this extra one and life will be good. They don't work that way. It always requires behavioral modification and behavioral help. And so I've always balanced that out in my head with, I wish it weren't this way where people felt that pills were the answer to everything or drugs will fix everything. But I wish they would have the appreciation that for this group of people here, they can be truly life-saving.
Yeah.
And that is a hard line.
Your example of insulin, yeah, definitely startled me because, yeah, that's certainly a life-saving drug for a lot of people, really important, critical, drug. So, yeah, having people develop antipathy toward a drug like that seems very concerning. Yeah. Do you notice anything different in the new pharmacists that are coming through from who are, do you see anything different in their attitudes or their training from when you came through?
That is a really good question. So much has changed since I came through. This is going to be a statement of my age. When I first came through pharmacy, I was maybe the third graduating class after the degree had changed from a Bachelor of Science to only a Doctor of Pharmacy. You could no longer get the 5-year degree. You were there for a full, well, it turned out to be a full 8 years. It's 4 years at pharmacy school, but 4 years before that. And then on top of that, generally pharmacists have to get to be competitive in the marketplace, some sort of a specialized residency on top of that. So you could be talking, your current pharmacist is coming out with potentially 10 years of education to work whatever job. And there are so many different kinds of pharmacists out there. I think people think about their corner drugstore pharmacy as the main one, but there are pharmacists that work in nuclear pharmacy that make those drugs that are used during some nuclear specialty tests, and they need to know isotopes. And so they're on a whole level. You have people like myself that worked specifically rounding with the physicians and the nurses and the team next to the bedsides in an ICU and have a different approach to their practice. So there are all kinds of pharmacists. And I think what I see coming out of the newer pharmacists is that they have given themselves a dedication of all these years they need to be in school to come and do something that they hope to do. And the field is changing. So I think sometimes the pharmacist that's coming out is looking for a field that may or may not be there in the short distance. There have been a lot of, so you're getting these very educated, very knowledgeable, say, let's just say an ICU hospital pharmacist, but those positions now are far and few between as hospital systems cut back on personnel and change the way they're doing that practice. And so that pharmacist that's coming out may or may not have the career that they were intending on. And so sometimes I see a frustrating mismatch with the new grads coming out and what they're anticipating in the job market. It'll be interesting to see how the job markets change over the years and where they help that go. I see a lot of the newer pharmacists very interested in having and working at some ambulatory clinics where they can be engaged in helping take the blood pressure and helping do the diabetes monitor of patients that come in. I did that back when I was going to school, 30 something years ago, but there weren't as many places in the career for that now. And now with the cutbacks of physicians also, pharmacists are now also being looked at as physician extenders to certain extents. And so working a hypertension clinic or blood pressure clinic, helping the diabetics stay on their insulin well, that's where I see some of the new grads looking at some really good career opportunities that are not just good opportunities, but also very satisfying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're looking for something for themselves maybe in a different way than previous generations have. Yeah. So interesting. Right. Yeah. I observe that as well as I'm working with younger people in the fields. They're often very mission driven, which is great. But yeah, it's different from the way people talked in my generation. So I have to ask you this question, though. I'm springing it on you a bit. So what about AI in the pharmacy work. What do you think there's potential for that? You worry about that? What are your thoughts?
There is definitely potential for that. It's been around in some level for even the last decade of my career. As physicians were asked more and more to use computers to try to document all their information, there have been people who have been programming what I might call critical think software, that if you enter in enough labs or enough symptoms that a patient has, then the computer tries to say, hey, this might be a list of the top 4 diagnoses that you could look for. And in the pharmacy field, you already see that kind of. It's not essentially AI, it's just pre-programmed knowledge that kicks out a sheet at the pharmacy that they hand you that says, oh, here are your drug interactions you could have, or watch out for this. Okay. You take that the next step further. So I had already seen, before I left practice a couple of years ago, people trying to make, because what you have to have with AI in the medical field and in pharmacy is critical think at multi-levels that are willing to branch off into other multi-levels and try to replicate human thought. And I think we're quite a distance away from that being the perfect solution now. What I worry about more is that a tool will be developed that, because of costs and implementation decisions from large companies, that it will be pushed forward before its time. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen on even some of the clinical decision-making software that's been out there, some of the providers would use it and come up with some ideas, but then they would sidebar. And that's where the human aspect of, I saw this one patient one time, I'm going out on a limb here, but these symptoms remind me of XYZ. And sometimes they're right. And
sometimes they're right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, deeper human logic and deeper human experiential pieces that are brought to the table that we are very far from recreating with AI. Not too worried about it unless it gets launched too fast.
I just recently did an episode about AI, and I just keep coming back to the idea the human brain is just amazing. It's just amazing, right? And what it's capable of, which, is great, right? It's sort of a celebration of our species.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Miffie. It's been so much fun to talk to you. Thank you for writing the book. And before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience?
Yes, I would love it if you would join me on my website at grimreaders.com. I'm regularly posting some other ways to go about a new drug that's on the market, or new errors, or new things that you can pull into plots and what you might want to consider. And that's been a really good place for people to also contact me with some of their questions they've had that have read my book and worked through some of those writing scenarios. And then I've had a few people consult me through that site, saying, okay, look, I've done this. Here's what you said to do. How's it looking? And then I can help them a little bit massage that into a good final form with maybe some of the dialogue that's not quite on, or something like that. And but that's a great place for them to join me.
That's lovely. Yeah, that's really great. I'll be sure and include the link in the show notes. And so again, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, and for the work that you did with newborns and premature babies. And now
that was my pleasure.
And now sharing your knowledge with us in the book. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Our goal in 2024 is to expand our audience, because we get such great guests. So we'd love your help in spreading the word by sharing, subscribing, liking, thumbs upping, rating, and commenting. Got all that? Really, thanks for any support. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Also, a shout out to Podomatic, our podcast hosting platform. You podcasters out there might want to check them out. They've been good to us. And finally, thanks to Quincas Morera for the theme music.